Hi, I'm Tim. Welcome to Watchbox. Thanks for logging on and welcome back to Versus. While Rolex versus Omega might be a classic lineup, Tudor watches have improved to such a degree that today I can confidently say we have a battle on our hands. We're comparing the Omega Seamaster 300 1957 Trilogy with the Tudor Heritage Black Bay 58. Let the games begin. Now, these timepieces are very similar in their design philosophy, their size, their technical specifications, and the way they fit, but they are very different in some key respects, notably the theme at play in each watch. One of them is a re-edition, one of them is a modern watch retro-inflected. Let us start with what I can only consider to be the overdog and perhaps the early favorite on the basis of price. Now, I should explain this watch, when it retailed new in 2017, the 60th anniversary of reference CK2913, the first Seamaster diver. This watch in 2017 was a $7,000 watch, all of which is to say, comparing to the 2021 price of the Heritage Black Bay, $3,700, this Omega should be almost twice the watch. That said, on the wrist, it's anything but. It's almost physically identical. These are both 39mm steel watches. The Omega is 14.3 millimeters thick, 48 millimeters from lug to lug, and 19 millimeters between the lugs. When I throw it on my 16 centimeter circumference wrist, I'm really getting a vintage experience. Now, you can see the watch is very compact across the wrist. You can also see that this is very different from almost any other modern Seamaster, including the Seamaster 300, which is a little bit thematically more comparable to the Tudor as a modern watch, vintage inflected. This is a real re-edition, designed almost detail for detail to evoke the original, and you could see right down to the crystal, which, though it is sapphire, features the little etched Omega logo over the hands that you would have found on the original plexiglass. We have patina style lume, we have a broad arrow minute hand, a Dauphine style, or I should say broad arrow hour hand, Dauphine style minute hand, vintage logos, vintage font. We have Arabic numerals printed at the quarters, a bidirectional rotating true vintage style bezel, and then a bracelet that, at least before you get to the clasp, is very much styled to look like the vintage article. The case, true to history, has a narrow case band, a minimally beveled profile along the lugs. They are squared off, and there is a no-guard crown profile with a correct Naiad center, and then you could see that there is a vintage Omega logo on there. There's a vintage Omega logo on the dial, and then we have a vintage Omega logo on the clasp. Now, the clasp is one of the few parts of this watch that is unabashedly contemporary. You can see, though it does have that vintage logo, the trigger mechanism that opens the clasp is thoroughly modern, and then the clasp itself is milled out from the solid and includes a push-button slider that gives you 9.6 millimeters of incremental sizing flexibility, and then we have a bracelet with many removable links, and you can see they are fixed in place by screws, modern construction. The case back, though, we get back to the brutally faithful vintage style. As you can see, it features the vintage hippocampus, the 60th anniversary notation, and then a term that's been extinct in the watch industry for generations, waterproof. You can also see Omega, with good taste, mentioning coaxial master chronometer on the reverse side of the watch rather than on the dial side. And you could see that the sapphire used is dramatically cambered and domed, so that off-axis it actually looks like a plexiglass. This bezel is bidirectional because it was not until the ISO definition of 1996 that specified a unidirectional bezel that we had the modern definition of a diving bezel. However, by the 70s, we were beginning to see unidirectional bezel conversions for professional divers. This watch harks back to 1957, when a diving bezel could move in either direction. It's kind of curious. This is a 120-click bezel, and this, which is unidirectional, is actually a 60-click. So what's inside is a Omega caliber 8806. It's an automatic single barrel, a 55-hour power reserve Maytaz master chronometer, which means not only is the watch tested to chronometer standards per the ISO 3159, just like the COSC, but more so, as the watch is tested fully cased up, not as a bare movement. There are also tests of winding efficiency, power reserve, shock resistance, water resistance, and anti-magnetism, and it's tested in 6 positions, not the COSC's 5 positions. There is a stop seconds function. The crown is a screw-down unit. It beats away at 25,200 vibrations per hour, pivots on 35 joules. It has a full balance bridge with a free-sprung index, just like the Tudor, and that silicone hairspring to make it effectively simply a magnetic coaxial escapement, yes, just as Dr. Daniels intended, and this one's water resistant down to 300 meters. Now, taking a look at the Tudor debuted, as you see it here, 1 year after the 2017 Omega. So this was a 2018 model year watch, and unlike the Omega, which is evoking a specific reference, the CK2913, this watch is more of a general tribute to the Rolex and Tudor no-guard submariners of the late 50s, early 60s. So this is more of an ambiance watch. It's designed to recall an era and the watches of that era, but not a specific reference. Now, in terms of dimensions, it's almost the same. 39 millimeters in diameter, whereas the Omega is 48 millimeters lug-to-lug. This one is 47.8 millimeters. There is a difference between the lugs, where the Tudor is more likely to take standard size straps, as this is a 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs, and this right here is 19, which is a less common size and more likely to require custom cut straps if you want to accessorize. The timepiece is considerably thinner though, at 11.9 millimeters against the 14.3 of the Omega. There is a huge difference in thickness here, and so thin is the Tudor that it actually undercuts the Submariner from Rolex by almost a full millimeter. So this is a very elegantly packaged watch, this Tudor. The timepiece, of course, as I mentioned, has a unidirectional rotating bezel. It is 60 click, and it is a louder and more pronounced click than the refined glide of, for example, the Submariner, but it has a wonderful micro knurling outboard, just like the Seamaster, that makes it an absolute pleasure to handle the bezel. Now, both of these watches used anodized aluminum inserts inside the bezel, as their more upscale cousins elsewhere in the model line or elsewhere in the corporate family, in the case of the Tudor, will use ceramic bezel inserts. Now, this is a unidirectional winding bezel. You can see it cannot turn backwards, so this is a real ISO 6425 style dive watch. You have a timing instrument that cannot accidentally extend the dive because it cannot move in the wrong direction. Vintage Q's a little bit confused here with the Tudor. They're paying tribute to the snowflake Tudor Submariners of the late 60s through mid 70s, and you can see that with the hour hand and the minute hand and the seconds hand. But then the rest of the dial, with its chaptering, its gilt style print, its matte base, its no date presentation, and the fact that, of course, this is also a no guard case. This watch is also nodding to watches like the Tudor 7922 and the Tudor 7924 from the 1950s. So it is paying broad reference to Rolex and Tudor watches built between roughly 1954 and 1975. It's got a little bit of all of them in there, as well as the transitional bevel on the lugs. This is another nod to the history of Rolex and Tudor Submariners, because right up through the late 1980s, they shared cases made by Rolex and bracelets made by Rolex, and they would have both featured that hand beveling regardless of brand. You can see that the timepiece is a little bit different in finish. It's polished on its case flanks and then satin finished on its lug hoods, whereas the Omega features satin on its case band and then polish on its lug hoods. Taking a quick look at the bracelet, this is what we call a skeuomorph. It is something that is functionally distinct but representationally identical to another thing, and it is representationally identical to the Rolex Rivet bracelets of the 50s and early 60s, like the 7205, the 7206, and I guess this would be like a 7206 because it has a 20 millimeter end link. Make no mistake though, the removable links here are fixed in place by screws. It is not a rivet construction. Now, inside the clasp, we have some features I like and some features I don't. I like the fact that it's a solid assembly. It's far better than the stamped Rolex and Tudor bracelets of past and stamped clasps of the past. What I also like is that there are ceramic spring-loaded pin snaps so that the tolerances will remain sharp and tight over time, as there's no way that the steel can aggress against the ceramic. So that's great. That'll ensure that it feels crisp for years and even decades to come. There is a set system, 3 divots, which you can adjust with a strap tool for altering the anchoring point of the bracelet, and I think the Omega's got it all over the Tudor on this count. This is a bit of a pain. If I could have a push-button slider, I would be much happier. Rolling over to the dial of the watch, it's somewhere between black and tobacco. It's definitely got a brown undertone, accentuated by the rose gold plated applique indices, as well as the gilt rose gold print. You can see, again, another reason this is a modern watch that pays tribute, but not slavish tribute to vintage. You see there are applique indices here, whereas on the Omega, much truer to history with printed features. So it doesn't have that height above the dial you would get on a more modern watch. Inside the case, you have a movement built just for this model, the MT5402, which is both thinner and smaller in diameter than the 41mm Black Bay's 5602. The difference is 26 millimeters versus 31.8 millimeters, and in terms of thickness, the standard 5602 is a 6.5 millimeter thick movement, whereas the movement in here is 4.99 millimeters thick. So advantage Tudor. 70-hour power reserve here versus 55 for the Omega. You get a silicone hairspring, you get a 27 joule stop second movement. It has a full balance bridge, it's free sprung, and of course it's a COSC certified Swiss chronometer. The real advantage here is going to be that it has a bespoke movement, which is something this watch does not have. It does not have a movement shared with no other model. This does. The movement was made just for the Black Bay 58. And I would also say with the higher beat rate and the longer power reserve, you have some potential advantages there. So let's throw this one on the wrist real quick, get a sense of how it fits. And it is much thinner, and you can easily see on the wrist that it is far thinner and more elegant. The timepiece is almost identical across the wrist and almost identical when viewed from the top, but from this angle, you can see which of these two watches is, frankly, engineered more impressively, and secondarily, more compatible with a tight sleeve or dress cuff. So let's talk about what these watches do better relative to each other. Starting with the Omega, which, as I mentioned, is sort of the power in this space, the longer standing model line, and the first of these to debut by 1 year. So this is more faithful to history. So if you want a true CK2913 re-edition, this is that. It is slavishly true. If you want line for line, detail for detail, Omega really sweated it to get the details right. Now, this is also a reference to a specific model. So if you really love the 2913, this is basically that reborn swimmable with none of the provenance, condition, and Franken issues you find with true vintage watches. Exclusivity. This was a limited edition for 2017. The standard Trilogy model was made in 3,557 pieces. There was an even smaller matched serial Trilogy made in 357 pieces. So this watch right here, 3,557 pieces, whereas the Tudor, though somewhat limited in production, is not actually limited to an edition number. Now, I'll also say this watch, new at $7,000, sells pre-owned for $7,950. So if you do happen to find one of these new, you can buy it and you can wear it for a year and sell it pretty much for what you paid for it. It's been a few years since this was on the market, but 3,557 is not a small edition number. If you do find one, you're going to get the same 5-year warranty you get with the Tudor, and you're going to be able to sell it for close to or above what you paid. So, also impressive, the clasp. Both the trigger release and the push-button slider system has it all over the Tudor. This is just a better system, and this is where having one modern watch component on the timepiece without really worrying about historical accuracy really pays dividends. The clasp is a much better piece. And if you do plan to use these watches in the line of fire, that is actually in the field, the Omega does have a 300-meter water resistance rating to 200. Maybe academic, but then again, more is more, and that is point Omega. Let's talk about the Tudor. Movement power reserve, 70 hours versus 55. That's straightforward. There's also a higher beat rate here, 28,800 vibrations per hour versus 25,200. That is a beat rate that Omega and all Swatch Group brands use for silicone hairsprings. This has a silicone hairspring and potentially greater resistance to shock-induced timing deviation because of the higher beat rate. So advantage Tudor. Superior bezel. Not only is it a true unidirectional bezel, so you can actually use it as a reliable timing instrument, but I like the feeling of the micro knurling. I like the tones. I like the color combination used. I like the fact that it's just a little bit more attractive. It's not perhaps as austere and, if we're honest, cheap looking as the bezel on the Omega. I'll also say, though it's a 60 click rather than 120, the click and the feel more satisfying here. I'm also going to say that, frankly, I'm agnostic on COSC versus Métas. They conform to the same ISO 3159, so I'm not going to give the advantage to the Omega, even though there are many virtues to that test, because Tudor does test the watch as a cased-up timepiece before it leaves the factory, so I have no doubt they are equally accurate. I will also say this is probably the one to buy new, as you could buy it for $3,700. You could sell it pre-owned at its current pre-owned price of about $4,300, and Even when you buy this watch, it leaves thousands of dollars still in play to buy another watch or take it on a vacation and have an adventure. The fact that the watch sells used for $4,300 means it is still a more accessible watch than the pre-owned price of this 1957 Trilogy, so you can still get into this watch even slightly marked up over retail with money left over to do other fun things and buy other cool stuff. I'll also say the unique movement is impressive. This movement, you'll find it identical in the standard Seamaster 300, among others, whereas this movement was designed just for the Black Bay 58, which is a very impressive thing. You don't expect watches in the sub $4,000 price point to have bespoke calibers designed just for their case size and thickness. Truly, we do here. This is 26 millimeters versus 31.8 for the standard Black Bay caliber 5602. It is also thinner and considerably thinner at 4.99 millimeters thick, this movement, versus 6.5 for the standard Black Bay caliber. Super impressive. This watch is also so much thinner that I can't even imagine reaching for the Omega in the event that I need a watch to wear that's going to be a dress watch and a sports watch and an elegant watch. This timepiece, though it fits identically, wears thinner, more graceful, and thin costs money. So real energy, time, and cash was invested in making this movement compact. Finally, the lume of this watch is superior to what you will get on the Omega. So let's just review the things that are exactly the same before I give you my conclusion and my choice. Diameter is the same. Lug-to-lug dimension, almost exactly the same. The chronometer certifications, I consider, because of the way they're prepared at the factory, I consider them to be functionally accurate, equally precise, and equally durable too, because they both have free-sprung balances with full balance bridges and anti-magnetic silicone hairsprings. They both have a stop seconds feature, and the warranty on both of these, now that Tudor has stepped up to the plate, they are both 5-year warranties. So which one do I like better? Simple. It's the Tudor. I don't like slavish vintage reeditions. I appreciate that this is a modern watch, that it gives you modern watch features like unidirectional bezel, like applique indices on the dial, that it pays reference and deference to history, but it isn't just a watch that's basking in reflected glory. It's not the watch you buy because you really wanted the vintage one and you settled for this. This is a watch you buy because you want a Black Bay 58. I'll also say the 20 millimeter spacing between the lugs makes it more amenable to aftermarket straps, which is definitely something you're going to do on a mass market luxury diver. The lume is superior. I like lume. That's a big deal for me. I use my watch in the dark, and I frequently reference my Zinn EZM, which is a great example of lume done right, and so it is here. You will see the lume shot at the end of this video. I'm also going to say that the timepiece being so much thinner and more graceful, and the money spent to make it that way, is hugely appealing to me. There's also the sensual factor, the way the bezel feels when I turn it, the knurling, the detent. It's hard to express other than to simply say I like it better. This is a beautifully packaged modern watch that does everything I expect of a modern watch, and I can forgive it for its fake rivet bracelet and its somewhat behind the times clasp, because everything else is so uniformly excellent about it. But here there are no wrong answers, so you guys let me know in the description below which of these two cost no object would you prefer to put on your wrist. I'm back with the Black Bay 58 and the Seamaster 300, and I should mention I'm going to add price to my list of advantages for the Black Bay. Costs less new or used. But here we're talking about lume, and a feature that becomes more and more evident the longer you sit in the dark with these watches is the brighter and more sustained glow of the Black Bay 58. Both of these watches feature simulated patina lume, but the Omega beats you over the head with its photina, whereas it's a more subtle tone on the Black Bay 58. As a result, the Omega lume is not quite as bright in the dark, and the gap between them becomes more and more pronounced the longer you keep the light off. So on that final count, lume, advantage Black Bay.